They say money is the root of all evil, but I think you could make a case for swapping in the word ego there, at least an ego that's unexamined and unchecked. I turned my head and looked at her to show off my bike riding skills, and I slammed right into a wall. And now here's the clincher. I was just 4 years old. I remember telling my coach Higgin after a few weeks as a black belt that I felt my progress had come to a complete halt. And he said, "My friend, I give you my permission to tap." Welcome to the Ageless Warrior Lab. I'm BJJ Black Belt and Dirty Dozen member Dave Meyer, here to draw wisdom from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the martial arts and explore how it applies to success in business, relationships, your long-term health, and making the most out of your life. Many years ago, I once went out to dinner with some black belt training partner friends of mine. It was me, my friend Tim McHale, who is a black belt in Danzanryu Jiu-Jitsu, my good friend Professor John Will, who was in from Australia, and Tim had invited this visiting high-level black belt in some other style of Jiu-Jitsu. And over the dinner, this master guy started telling Tim and John and I about this deadly straight punch he could do that was similar to Bruce Lee's famous 1 inch punch, where Bruce Lee would hit people in the chest from 1 inch away and send them flying backward. And at the table in this restaurant, he was describing the different ways he does this punch. Then he held his hand in a certain way and he said, "In my experience, when you do it this way, it usually bursts the aorta." Now, if you don't know, the aorta is the main artery that takes oxygenated blood from your heart and gets it to the rest of your body. And spoiler alert, if your aorta bursts and ruptures, that's very serious and life-threatening. Double spoiler alert, having this happen from a trauma to the chest is really rare and would usually be something like a high-impact car crash or falling from a roof. And triple spoiler alert, it's really unlikely that this martial arts master guy had ever hit anyone in the chest and burst the aorta, even once, let alone enough times to say that a particular technique usually bursts the aorta. Tim, John, and I kept a straight face and simply nodded and said, "Oh, really?" But it was clear that this guy had an ego that was so full of himself, he actually believed this nonsense he was saying. Now, in the martial arts, I've seen people with the most inflated egos. And I've also seen examples of people who are truly humble and who have really tamed their ego. And I've made a study of both. So, is there something in your life now where your ego is blinding you or is getting in your way? How would you even know? Or is there someone else whose ego is creating a problem for you? They say money is the root of all evil, but I think you could make a case for swapping in the word ego there, at least an ego that's unexamined and unchecked. But is ego always a bad thing? Is it ever a good thing? And what do we even mean when we say the word ego? Is it a tool to drive us to achieve great things or some petty selfish trait to be destroyed? My answer to that is yes. Yes, it's a good thing that drives us to achieve great things. And yes, it's a petty and selfish aspect of ourselves that we do need to keep in check. So let me share with you what I've learned about ego through my lifetime in martial arts. And let's explore one, what we mean by it, two, why it's generally bad, three, when it's good, and four, how to make use of it and keep it in check. This is going to be one of my longer life lesson episodes because ego, for me at least, is a big topic. No pun intended. Now, the word ego comes from Latin, where it just means I. And over time, it was used in discussions of philosophy and then psychology to refer to the self or a person's sense of self. Today, people associate the word with Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, who many people view as the father of modern psychology. I think the word today has a negative connotation and often means your sense of self-importance or how good you think you are, like he has a big ego. And that is the kind of ego I think is bad. But at a more fundamental level, your ego is your personality, what you think of as you, separate from me or anybody else. But I want to challenge that and say that your ego is not the real you. You are the observer of your ego. Your ego is what you project to yourself and what you project out to others, but the real you is something much deeper and much better. Buddhism teaches that what's usually called ego is just a mistaken way of understanding your true essence. And that leads to a fixation on me and mine as opposed to you and yours. And this is the way I look at it. This feeling of separateness from all around you causes a lot of personal and social suffering. In Buddhism, it represents an illusion of a separate permanent self that they say doesn't really exist. Now, I think it exists because we make it exist, but it leads to problems and suffering, and it doesn't have to be that way. Again, from the Buddhist perspective, the ego causes suffering because it causes you to react to things in the world, feeling yourself as distinct and separate from everything around you. And that leads to dissatisfaction, to fear, and just tension generally. It's like a baby. We selfishly grab at what we want. Over attachment to this ego construct is described as a basic ignorance in Buddhism that fuels greed and aggression and pride and jealousy, all patterns that keep suffering going for everyone. They distinguish between the illusion of this egoic self connected to what we call our mind and a basic functioning self to just navigate the world. Or as Dan Millman said in Way of the Peaceful Warrior, the mind is a useful tool to remember where you put the keys. But you are not your mind. You are not your ego. So let's just define ego as a sense of self, a personality that feels separate from others, and that if we take too far, can make us be selfish and petty. Now, this doesn't mean I think we should all be these egoless entities like Buddhas with no attachment to any life outcomes. That honestly just seems boring. I think we can have a sense of self, but not be so attached to that self that it causes us or causes others around us to suffer. Ego, if you become aware of it, can be a tool, an aspect of ourselves to be tamed and used. In the martial arts, ego can get you injured. It can block your ability to learn, but it can also drive you to excellence. So let's first look at the ways ego is bad and can create problems for you. Having too much ego gives you an inflated sense of your skills and value. You think you're more important than you really are. This would be the usually burst the aorta guy. Lots of people can fall victim to this, myself included at times. The ego wants prestige. And interestingly, the word prestige comes from the Latin prestigii, I think it's pronounced, meaning deceit or illusion, like prestidigitation, which means sleight of hand trickery. Today, of course, the word prestige means honor or high status, but its root is a social illusion we buy into and that we create. And I think that there's an important learning there. Often something we seek out for ego or see as prestigious, especially if we see it in ourselves, is a bit of an illusion or a deception. I remember I was a good bike rider as a kid. I was riding two-wheel bikes earlier than other kids, and I remember seeing this pretty girl at school as I was riding my bike on the playground. And I turned my head and looked at her to show off my bike riding skills, and I slammed right into a wall. And now here's the clincher. I was just 4 years old. Even at 4 years old, I had an ego that had me wanting to show off to a girl yet. To be honest, I can't say I've grown that much in 60 years. But my point is, ego runs deep and it starts early. And I guess that's not that much of a surprise because selfishness runs deep, right? Kids grabbing a toy and screaming, "That's mine," is an act of ego and a sense of separation of the self from the world around you. Mine and not yours. Funny thing about martial arts is we have both ends of the spectrum. We have people who actually fight and otherwise are very clear on their limitations and who remain humble. And then we have the people who usually don't fight, so have built up what's really a false sense of greatness in themselves, usually as they become instructors and get the admiration of their students. And they're living in this fantasy world about their skills, like the usually burst the aorta guy, because those skills are never put to a test. I have had a lot of experience with lots of these, what I call armchair senseis, who are high level martial arts instructors, but who've never been in a fight, yet still they think they're amazing sages of fighting. It's their ego run amok. John Will and I were once traveling together and teaching seminars, and we taught at the school of one of these type of guys in Northern California. After I taught some what I thought was really functional BJJ stuff, the instructor felt he needed to show off a bit to his students, so he called me up to be the attacker, his partner, as he demonstrated a self-defense against someone throwing a punch at his head. and he told me to throw a punch. So I threw a punch, but I pulled it just short of smashing him in the face because I obviously didn't want to hurt him. And he said, no, 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 throw it slower. I swear it was all John and I could do to not burst out laughing. I mean, if you have to tell an attacker to punch you slower so you can grab and twist their arm, maybe what you're showing won't actually work if someone for real is trying to hit you in the face. Now, one thing about martial arts that are practiced as sports where you compete against a non compliant opponent, and I'm talking here about kickboxing and judo and wrestling and Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, boxing, full contact karate, and things like that, is it reveals not how good you think you are or not how good you say you are, but how good you really are. You can have ego, but you had better be able to back it up. The only caveat I'd add to that is you can only measure yourself against the quality of whoever it is you train with. So if your training partners suck and you're better than them, you may still not be as good as you think because you're not being tested against really good opponents. That's just another reason to find the best partners and the best school or dojo you can and train there. As I've said before, be the tail of the lion and not the head of the sheep. Now, one thing I loved about Brazilian Jiu Jitsu from day one was that competitive nature. Certainly back in the early days, and I hope largely still today, the belt ranking wasn't awarded because you had been at the school for a certain amount of time or paid a certain amount of money or anything like that. That's what happens in some styles that leads to those armchair senseis I was talking about. But Brazilian Jiu Jitsu was a true meritocracy, and I think it still is. If you're a blue belt, you can beat the white belts. And if you're a purple belt, you can beat the blue belts and on through brown and black. In fact, the way to progress up the belts, at least when I was coming up, was to consistently start beating some people who were in the belt group above you. Now, this leaves room for plenty of ego, but again, you've got to be able to back it up. I remember when I was a white belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and recall I had been a black belt in other styles of Jiu Jitsu for many years. So I was a really good white belt. And I finished a Saturday morning training with my coach, Higan Machado, in his backyard. And Higan then pointed out this white belt guy who had just showed up late and said the guy's name was Peachy. And he had just come in from Brazil and would I train with him? Higan told me that Peachy was really talented, but he had only trained with Higan for about 3 months before Higan left and came to the United States. So Peachy was very rusty. Now, I was tired from my training, but I never said no to another match. So I said, sure, I'll roll with Peachy. This guy, Peachy, was about my size and didn't speak a word of English. So we started to train, and I could feel he was strong and kind of stiff and really rough around the edges, like a typical beginning white belt. And he pulled me into his guard, meaning he was on his back and he closed his legs around me. And then he started to execute this very basic move called a scissor sweep to try to come on top of me. It wasn't set up right, but he was so strong and he actually off balanced me and he got on top of me sitting in the mounted position. And then he did this very basic armbar from the mount using his strength, and I had to tap. And I was pissed because I had just finished 90 minutes of training and I didn't expect this guy to be so strong. And I decided, okay, it's time to get serious and kick his ass. So we started again. And again, he pulled me into his guard, and basically the same thing happened, and I tapped. Now I was really frustrated, not at Peachy, but at me for just not taking this seriously. So we started again, and I came at him hard, and this time using a series of different basic moves. Again, very rough around the edges, but using his strength. Damn it, if he didn't make me tap again. At this point, I was exhausted, but I couldn't chalk his wins up to me being tired. I was used to being tired, and I was the best white belt we had. He just was better than me. So I turned to Hagen and I said, please don't be offended, coach. But if this guy who's trained for 3 months a long time ago with you is this good right now, if he gets serious and stays with it, I could see him getting to be as good as you. And Higgins said, yeah, he's really good. And for the whole rest of the weekend, my ego was bruised that there was this beginner white belt who was better than me. And I dragged myself into the Monday evening class at the other Machado school, which was being taught by Higgins' brother, Jean-Jacques. And I remember walking in and him sitting behind the desk, looking at me and smiling. And he said, Higgin told me you tapped out 3 times to Peachy. And I just lowered my head. And I said, yeah, I did. I'm sorry. And Jean-Jacques said, you know, Peachy's been training for 8 years and he's the current purple belt champion in Brazil. And then he broke out laughing, and he told me that Peachy is a gato do tatame, which literally means a cat on the mat, or what we call in English a mat rat, training all the time. Now, I was pissed that they let me suffer the whole weekend like that. But once I saw the humor, my ego was suddenly healed. Peachy played the part of a white belt flawlessly, by the way, beating me with movements he intentionally made feel clunky and basic. And I have actually played that trick on a few other people in the years since. But the thing here is my performance fighting Peachy was my performance. It didn't suddenly get better when I learned Peachy was the Brazilian national champion purple belt, but I suddenly felt better. What changed was my ego was no longer bruised. Now, sometimes ego can work both for you and against you. Again, back when I was a white belt, I was gunning for blue belts and I was so eager to get that first promotion to blue belt. That was my ego driving me to excel, which I think is good. And when I finally got promoted to blue belt, I was so happy. Remember, I had taken off my black belt in other styles of jiu-jitsu when I started training in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So this meant I was on my way climbing back up the ladder. Then I was hungry for a purple belt. And again, that was ego driving me to work hard. And eventually I started tapping out some purple belts. And I really felt like I had arrived when I got my purple belt. Lots of ego and lots of pride. But when I got my brown belt, I started to feel something different. I wasn't feeling the hunger to get a higher belt so much, but I was more feeling the responsibility of defending the belt I had. When I got that brown belt, I really felt the target on my back from other people of lower ranks, and I started to fight more conservatively. My ego was still there in spades, but it wasn't driving me to get better. It was driving me to defend what I already had. I just didn't want to lose, so I stopped taking chances on new techniques. My ego stopped me from learning as fast as I had been. And then I'll never forget the day I got my black belt. It was a surprise to me and to Chris Howder and Rick Williams. We all got our belts on the same day, and I didn't want it. I don't think they did either. I felt it was too soon. And once that heavy, in the emotional sense, belt was around my waist, all I could think of in training was don't tap, don't tap. At that point, pretty much everyone I trained with was a lower belt than me, and they had nothing to lose to go all out trying to tap out a black belt every single time we rolled. My ego, as a driver of me getting better, was now fully working against me and not for me. It wasn't allowing me to get better, and it was just trying to defend my position. I remember telling my coach Higgin after a few weeks as a black belt that I felt my progress had come to a complete halt. I was only training to not lose and didn't feel able to take chances and keep learning new things to get better. And Higgins smiled and he said, "My friend, it's okay to tap. Everybody taps. I give you my permission to tap." And once he said that, it was like he lifted a ego weight off of me, and I was able to get back to training normally and feel like it's okay if I lose and start again taking chances and learning new things. So ego can cloud your vision of how good you are and inflate your sense of your capabilities and can block you from taking chances and improving yourself. But ego can also make you close off to seeing where you actually may be wrong and need to improve. It doesn't let you shore up your weaknesses. Back again to my early days in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I was really excited to share this amazing new variant of Jiu-Jitsu that I had found with other Japanese Jiu-Jitsu instructors. There was this one prominent instructor in Los Angeles where I lived who I finally got to agree to have me come down to his gym and just show him some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I noticed he told me to come by significantly after his class so that no students were present. It was just him and me, which was fine. We sat on the mat and I said, "Okay, let's roll," so I could let him feel some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu moves. I swept and mounted him, which means I turned him over and got on top, and he immediately made a grab for my groin. Now, in fairness, we hadn't said what the rules were, but it's pretty universally understood that in any sport format, a groin grab would not be legal. But I misdirected his hand and I tapped him out in a cross choke from the mount. And this all repeated several times. And then he explained to me that I wouldn't be beating him if he was allowed to actually do his pressure point attacks, which is what he would do in a real fight. So I, of course, said, "Well, feel free to use pressure points." And needless to say, it didn't change the outcome. Then he needed to prove to me what a great martial artist he was, and he explained, well, the pressure attacks have to be delivered concussively, like a strike to the neck that will render you unconscious, yet totally unharmed. So I sat on the mat And I just invited him to hit my neck wherever he wanted. And he said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yeah, yep." So he proceeded to sort of karate chop the back of my neck, lightly at first, and trying at these different angles. But when he saw it was having no effect on me, he kept increasing the intensity. Finally, I started to get annoyed because it was bothering my neck, and I didn't want him to hit my neck any harder. And I told him to stop. And he seemed genuinely surprised that it didn't work. I assumed that his students were all in awe of him and either pretended to be knocked out when he did this to them or somehow convinced themselves that they were getting knocked out. And in a final show of his lack of effectiveness, which is not what I was trying to prove, I invited him to do a rear naked choke on me, with my only defense being tensing up my neck. Now, if he had had even basic skill at that choke, I would have had to tap out or pass out, but he didn't. And he couldn't put me out, even with me using no hands to defend and just tensing my neck. Now, one would assume that this would have led to a major rethinking of his entire martial arts capabilities, and he might have gone out the next day to sign up for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, like I had. But a week later, someone told me he was teaching an entire seminar on pressure point knockout strikes, and he said to the audience that these techniques are almost always effective, but in rare cases, they might not be, for example, on Dave Meyer. He had convinced himself that I'm some sort of outlier, which I assure you I am not. And that was his ego working to defend his position and blocking his ability to actually see a deficiency that he had and that I had helped put in plain sight. I never want to be that guy whose ego stops him from actually learning and getting better at anything. I always try to remind myself that I'm not always right and to let others teach me. And in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, even someone you're better than and you know more than can still teach you something if they know more about it than you do. So you should be open to that. And to be honest, in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, you sometimes have no choice but to be willing to see and accept when you're wrong. There's a moment in BJJ when you're caught in a finishing hold and the path out is getting smaller and smaller. And it's often the case that if someone is good enough to get you into a situation where you're near being injured or choked to unconsciousness, they are probably good enough to go the rest of the way. That is generally when it's time to tap. Now, it is a good skill to have to be able to execute what I call goal line defenses, which is the ability to get out of a terrible situation at the last moment, to be 6 feet under in the grave and fight your way back out. Coach Krissa and I discussed this in my interview with her. Generally, accepting when you've lost and tapping early is what allows you to avoid injury and fight again. Plus, even if you don't get injured with your goal line defense, spending your limited time on the mat fighting to survive some finish, I think, is often wasted time that could have been spent starting over and practicing how not to get caught in that position in the first place, which I think is generally a better use of your time. So in BJJ, you need to tame your ego and tap so you can learn. Don't think of it as giving in to an opponent or situation. Don't think of it as even losing. Think of it as opening a path to your next lesson for you to get better and succeed next time. You're giving yourself the ability to grow and live to fight another day. Remember, losing can teach you. Losing can fuel and inspire you. Each loss is like the pounding of the hammer of a blacksmith to make a sword, but it's that pounding and folding and pounding and folding again and again, hundreds of times, that makes the sword so durable. You are that sword when you're being beaten in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And of course, this isn't just a martial arts issue. People will assume they know all they need to know, and especially when it comes to politics, they'll defend their position. In politics, it's not just personal ego, it's a tribalism, right? But it's all on the same spectrum. It's all part of that view that I or my tribe is separate from you and your tribe, and so you're wrong and I'm right. So to grow and learn and get better, don't assume you know everything. Don't defend your mental position. Try to expand it. Be open to being proven wrong. Being too invested in what you believe makes you avoid what feels like the embarrassment of having the truth revealed, but that just limits your growth. The other thing I'll say about how ego makes it hard for you to admit defeat or recognize when a course correction is your best path is it urges you to engage in the sunk cost fallacy. And that's, of course, the term for when you have already invested time and effort and money into something that's clearly not working. But instead of being able to cut your losses and accept the cost has already been sunk and can't be recovered, you decide to still persist because you've put in that much effort, and then you end up spending even more time, effort, and money. One of the best examples I can think of this is you've bought tickets for a movie and you start watching the movie, and pretty soon you realize it's a terrible movie. But you don't want to just walk out because you've already taken the time to drive to the theater and to pay for parking and you've paid for the tickets. But of course, the truth is, those are all sunk costs. Whether or not you stay for the rest of the movie, you can't get that time and money you spent to get there back. So the only thing to consider moving forward is, would you rather spend the rest of your night watching a crappy movie or doing something else instead? Now, if you add ego to the sunk cost, where cutting your losses means admitting you were wrong, it'll be even harder for you to walk away and change paths. The truth is, you can be fully into something, into doing something, and also perfectly willing to back off it if it turns out not to be the right path. The trick is to not be wedded to what you're doing, but be wedded to growing and getting better. That means staying the course, or that might mean setting your ego aside and admitting you're wrong or admitting defeat. Now, another bad thing that comes from ego is it can cause you to lash out at others who bruise your ego. You get insulted by something someone says or does. And what's worse, you may just be assuming a bad intent when there actually wasn't any. In fact, there may have been no intent at all. The person may not even know you exist. I was just at my gym the other day, and the guy who's there every day cleaning wanted to get in and clean the ladies' locker room. So he stood outside the door and he shouted, "Cleaning crew," into the locker room to see if anyone would respond. And nobody responded. But he turned to me and he said, "I know there's this gray haired woman in there because I saw her go in. She's just being a bitch and not responding." And I immediately knew that that just couldn't possibly be true. So I said to him, "Well, maybe she's gray haired. Maybe she's old. Maybe she doesn't hear well. Maybe she just didn't hear you because she's got earphones in her ears. Or maybe, she's just not expecting to hear someone shouting from the door of the locker room." And I gave him a bunch of plausible reasons the woman might have not responded. And just then, she came walking out, oblivious to our conversation and not having heard that anyone was shouting anything from the door. And the cleaning guy thanked me, and he admitted he always assumes the worst. So don't always assume the worst, because that's almost never true. Assume the best. I mean, really, if someone's doing something that you're interpreting as bothersome, maybe it's just not about you. Consider that when things upset you personally, it's probably because you're just taking them personally or you're personally identifying with them. This is ego showing its ugly head. We react when we feel we've been slighted or disrespected. And this doesn't mean it's okay for people to actually insult or disrespect us. But how we feel and how we react internally is under our control. I think only once you understand this can you really take control of your story, by which I mean not having control of your happiness and your moods in the hands of other random people instead of you. Within reason, no one should be able to do or say something to instantly make you be upset and have a bad day. Your reaction is your responsibility, but ego kicks in so fast that we just don't feel angry or hurt. We are angry and hurt. My mom was a psychologist who used to say, "Let it flow and let it go," by which she meant express your feelings in the moment, ideally tactfully, but do express your feelings, and then let it go. Only you are harmed by staying angry or holding a grudge. So feeling insulted and assuming the worst is all tied up to that ego that I said is the root of all evil. It's the mistaken feeling that we're fundamentally separate from everyone around us. That feeling of separation leads to a level of competitiveness and envy that can be really ugly. For example, research has shown that people often feel richer when they see others are doing worse, not when they themselves are actually doing better. This is called a downward social comparison, and it's well researched in papers like Their Pain, Our Pleasure, published in 2015. Relative wealth perception in comparison with other people influences happiness more than your actual income. That seems hard to believe, but it's actually true. The last bad effect of ego I'll mention is that it blocks your ability to expose yourself to new things and grow. You may have heard me say in other episodes, leave your ego at the door. If I could write that out and put it right above your door, I would. And my coaches, the Machado brothers, literally did have a sign above the doors of their gyms that said, "Leave your ego at the door." Setting aside your ego in BJJ makes you more open to learning, more fun to train with, and less likely to get injured or injure other people. Okay, now let's look at when ego can be useful. Having ego, so wanting to look good and caring about what others think, can drive you to achieve for yourself or for other people. I'm sure most successful founders and CEOs of big companies have lots of ego, and that's part of why they've been successful. I'm thinking here of Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or other super successful people like that. Now, those people may have all the downsides of ego too, being hard to deal with, not admitting mistakes, all that kind of stuff. But ideally, you can have ego that drives you to excel, but that's not so out of control that it makes you a nightmare to be around. I can think of a few examples where people have, for whatever reason, been able to set their ego aside, usually to achieve some other good outcome. I was a good friend of the late Professor Wally J., founder of Small Circle Jiu-Jitsu. Wally has lots of books and videos, and back in the 80s and 90s, he was often on the cover of martial arts magazines. And if the photo shoot was in LA, which it often was, he'd ask if I would be the dummy he could be doing a technique on in the photos. In Japanese, being that fall guy or the dummy who's getting the techniques done on them for practice or for demonstrations is called being the uke. And I was often Wally J's uke, both on magazine covers and in actual seminars he taught. This meant he would beat me up, and my role was just to take it. It meant I wasn't in the spotlight or able to show off any of my skills at all. My job was just adapt to whatever he did to me and minimize my chances of being injured. Now, even though I was ending up on magazine covers, or maybe especially because I was ending up on magazine covers being beaten up, I think of this as an example of me setting my ego aside for a chance to get something better, my ability to help my friend and teacher, plus to have this silly photo I'm now showing you if you're actually watching this on YouTube. And then another example, if you're into BJJ and submission grappling, you definitely know who Eddie Bravo is. He founded the system called 10th Planet, and he has his own association and a unique style of competition called the Eddie Bravo Invitational, EBI. I actually met Eddie on his very first day in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He came to check out the Jean-Jacques Machado School in Los Angeles, where I was training. And he tells the story of me as a purple belt grappling him and making him tap a bunch of times. I liked Eddie from day one. He seemed super smart and engaged. And I watched him over the years go up through the belt ranks and get harder and harder for me to beat. And by the time he was a brown belt, he was already well into developing his own unique style of grappling. And what particularly caught my interest was how he was developing and naming these new positions and having very specific and detailed game plans from each position. This was really unusual, and I told John Will in Australia how innovative Eddie was being and told John to hop on a plane and come out to the US. And together we paid for some private lessons from Eddie. We were two very experienced black belts paying to take private lessons from a brown belt who I'd known since his very first day. I remember Eddie being surprised and impressed by this, but to me and to John, it made perfect sense. Eddie had something he was developing that was clearly great and innovative, and so we set our ego aside and we just wanted to learn it. Now, this isn't to say we didn't have ego. We did, and we do have ego, and we wanted to get better. And setting that ego aside to really learn from Eddie what he was teaching and was developing was the best way to get better. As my coach Carlos Machado says, stay humble. And John and I were just being humble. But the best example I can think of, setting ego aside, is Dr. Jonas Salk, the scientist who developed the first effective polio vaccine. Fun fact, if you've heard my podcast mentioning the pet rescue efforts in New Orleans that I co-led after Hurricane Katrina, one of the people I did that with was Dr. Pia Salk, and that's Dr. Jonas Salk's niece. Before Jonas Salk developed that vaccine, polio killed or severely disabled hundreds of thousands of people every year. After Salk's vaccine was introduced in 1955, global polio cases fell by more than 99%, and millions of children who would have died or been paralyzed went on to live normal lives instead. Now, he got credit for that, but what stands out besides the amazing achievement is he declined to patent the vaccine, which would have made him a billionaire. He wanted it to be made available to everyone who needed it at the lowest cost possible. His famous quote about his decision to not patent the vaccine was that people owned it. He said, "Could you patent the sun?" He felt his discovery belonged to the world. And this is an amazing example of setting your ego aside. Can you, in your wildest dreams, imagine someone today walking away from billions of dollars just for the public good? So, inspired by Jonas Salk, let's talk about How to Tame Your Ego. And I use that term intentionally. I don't think you want to destroy your ego. We are distinct people with at times distinct needs. And we do want to be motivated to achieve things. In my case, achieving things that help the world. So the ego to me is a tool to do that. But it does need to be tamed. You can't let it run wild. You need to bring your ego into a useful balance with all your other tools and traits. To me, taming your ego can be broken into these 7 steps. Recognize the interdependence you have with everyone else. Notice your ego when it's arising, so have awareness. Question the story you're telling yourself, like, what else could this mean? Don't take things personally. Practice compassion for people who rile you up. Build yourself up instead of knocking others down. And seek out adversity and new experiences to stay humble. For me, the first and most important thing is to challenge this feeling that we are distinct from all around us. Nobody is truly independent unless you were dropped off as a baby in the wilderness naked and you somehow survived on your own. Everybody is interdependent. You benefit from everything you've been taught by other people. You breathe air created by plants. You drink water that's just present on the planet, no thanks to you. You eat food that other people worked hard to grow and transport and prepare. You wear clothes using fibers and designs and technologies that you had nothing to do with. You depend on and benefit from the work of thousands and thousands of people every single day. Remembering all that can begin the process of taming your ego. We need each other, and we are all in this together. The next step is to identify and observe your ego. Consider that this thing that feels like you is not the deeper you. I'm talking here about the fundamental essence of you, your soul, if you want to call it that. That if you sustained a head injury that caused you to lose your memory, or worse, caused you to have a whole new personality, there's still the deeper essence of you, and that's what you want to connect with. You are not your ego. You are the observer of your ego. So observe your ego when it arises, calm it, and use it as a tool. Just notice when you're feeling upset and make that your signal that your ego has gotten involved. And ask yourself, what's really going on here? Why is this thing bothering me? Can I deal with this external situation or person, but not take it personally, not perceive it as an attack on me or my ego? Even better is if you can recognize your own role in anything that's getting you riled up. Maybe the person in front of you really is a jerk and really is insulting you, but you're choosing to stay there and interact with them. Recognizing your own role in a situation gives you power. In a previous episode, I mentioned something called the Landmark Forum. They call it recognizing that you are cause in the matter, meaning you have some responsibility and some power. And that can change the whole way you're reacting to a situation. If you can recognize how you are cause in the matter of your own situation and of your own reactions, you can then look at the situation or person that's upsetting you in a less energized way. And even better is to have a compassion for whoever you feel is bothering you. Like you would look at some abused child who's just acting out and doesn't really even understand what they're doing. If someone has offended you, looking at them with compassion and even pity is a good way to dial down the energy you have around whatever the interaction was. It elevates you and gives you a whole new outlook. Here's the thing. I think the egoic mind orchestrates chaos and feeds off the drama. Your ego wants to get upset and be offended. That gives it meaning and gives it life. If everything were fine all the time, I honestly believe your ego gets bored and ceases to have a reason to exist. The ego doesn't exist strongly in a place of pleasantness and calmness, of happiness and tranquility. It wants conflict. So when you feel upset, look inward. Don't judge the circumstance or person who feels like the source. You bring your response to any stimulus. Your reaction is in you. You are cause in the matter. In the book, The 4 Agreements, the 4 agreements you're being advised to adhere to are: be impeccable with your word, don't take anything personally, don't make assumptions, and always do your best. And I think these are words to live by. Don't make meaning of what you don't understand, especially negative meaning. And if the meaning is clear and you feel offended and degraded by someone, deal with the situation, which may even mean cutting off contact with that person. But then do your best to not hold a grudge. Some things are better forgotten or at least forgiven. Let it flow and let it go. Let your ego drive you to be better in the future, but not make you dwell on the past. Joe Hyams, in his book Zen in the Martial Arts, tells a story of a student who came to Bruce Lee complaining about another student who was always beating him in sparring and asking Bruce what he could do to beat that student. Bruce then took some chalk and kneeled on the ground and drew two lines, one longer than the other. And he pointed to the shorter line and said, "This is you," and pointed to the longer line and said, "This was the other guy." Bruce then said, "What you're asking me to do is show you how to beat this student." And Bruce started to erase a bit of the length of the other student's line, making it shorter. But Bruce then said, "The problem is this person and this person," as he drew other lines that were also longer. And then he took the chalk and extended the line of his student to be the longest line of all. This, of course, made all the other lines shorter by comparison. And Bruce said, "Lengthen your line." I love this story because it takes the focus away from cutting others down and turns the focus on you. Lengthen your line. And the best way to do that is to seek out new experiences. In BJJ, always stop and visit schools when you travel. Tame your ego to open up the book of knowledge, what I call getting people to share what they know with you. Seek out and move into adversity. Get out of your comfort zone and try new moves and experiences. Set your ego aside. We funnel what we do towards our strengths, which can work, but then you also end up repeating patterns and not expanding your knowledge and capabilities. Be willing to move into your weaker areas to improve. Taming the ego is an ongoing practice like meditation. In fact, meditation is a core practice used by Buddhists and others to observe the ego and connect up to the more enduring part of yourself. Sitting quietly and focusing on your breath while being very focused on yourself in that moment is also a tool to remember who you really are. Within each breath lies the truth that you are moments away from dying if you can't take that next breath, that you didn't create or even earn the air that you're breathing, that you can be present in this moment without your egoic mind causing you to dwell on what just happened or what you want to happen in the future. Taming ego means having a healthy sense of me as a tool rather than as an identity I'm always trying to prop up or defend. So here's my invitation for you. Keep your ego on a leash. Don't put it on a throne. Use it like a tool. When it's time to drive hard, turn it on. When you need to learn, turn it down. And when you need to really grow, turn it off. Don't waste time defending a version of yourself that you're outgrowing. And when your ego gets loud, and it will, take a breath, step back, and remember this. You're not here to win every moment. You're here to become someone worth being. That's the work. Remember my initial question, is there something in your life now where your ego is blinding you or getting in your way? If so, learn to tame your ego. Right now is the best time to start. Feel free to share any stories of your ego that you think I'd find interesting in the comments if you're watching this on YouTube. And also, please like and share. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify podcasts, a review would be really helpful for us to spread the message. I'll be back next week with more lessons from the lab. In the meantime, keep developing your strengths, your wisdom, and go out and do good in the world.